Let's talk a little bit about making effective gear decisions. And this comes out of the publishing of our new Publisher's Gear Guide, which was updated this week. And the Publisher's Gear Guide, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is kind of my personal picks of gear I actually use on my personal trips. I got to thinking about in reading past Publisher's Gear Guides, which never really settled with me. How can I make something valuable to the user who can get a snippet of insight into how I make decisions? And so in the gear guide, I write little snippets for each piece of gear and what use cases I use that gear for. But I want to give you some deeper background here because I think this is important because choosing from multiple pieces of gear that do the same thing can consume a lot of mind energy. And if you have a lot of gear, it can be a barrier to enjoying the process of planning a trip. And so you're stuck between having to choose one piece of gear over another, and it's confusing and confounding for many people, including myself. And I find that, well, there's the paradox of choice. If you have too many choices, it becomes even more difficult. That's certainly true with backpacking gear as well. And I've used this decision making framework to try, the keyword is try to minimize the amount of gear I own. I get so much gear across my desk every week, and it's really easy to say, oh, that's cool for this particular narrow use case. I think I'll keep it. And then all of a sudden you're renting a storage unit. And I don't want to do that. I want to have gear that I love and use frequently, and I'm passionate about using in particular use cases. So here's the basic premise. One thing I have noticed so many people do is they look at two pieces of gear based on design features. So they'll look at a trekking pole tent and say, this one is a one pole tent, this tent is a two pole tent, or this tent has one vestibule, this tent has two vestibules, or the pitch angle of the end wall on this tent is 45 degrees and on this tent is 60 degrees. Those are all design attributes. Okay. Those feed into the features of a tent. But what we're really after is, what benefit is that design attribute or feature going to provide me at the end of the day? If you think about a tent, the core benefit is to provide you with some type of overhead shelter. And so in that respect, you can have tarps, you can have bivy sacks, you can have pyramid tents, pyramid shelters, you can have trekking pole tents, you can have hub and pole tents, geodesic domes, whatever. But the core benefit of a shelter is to provide you with some type of overhead protection. Within that realm, you can then have benefits that are specific to particular things you want to experience. I've listed two here. The first one is livability. And the question I ask is, how comfortable am I inside the tent if I have to spend extended periods of time in the tent? So if we look at the benefit of livability and then try to list the features that provide livability, the main feature we're looking at here is interior volume. And then you ask yourself, what aspects of product design contribute to those features? And so now we get into the engineering side, right on the right-hand side there. So the design features that impact interior volume, which give you the benefit of livable space, are things like the floor surface area, the pitch height, and the wall steepness. We can take a look at another one, the benefit being wind resistance. The question you're asking yourself, that psychological well-being question, is, will my tent fall down or flap in the wind? And the corollary would be, how am I going to feel if I feel like my tent is going to fall down or flaps in the wind? And the feature that contributes to that benefit is stability. And then the design attributes are things like rigid structural components, so poles or struts, cut and sew precision, which impacts how tightly or how taut a panel can be pitched. The forces that a tent transfers to the tent stakes impacts the tent stake holding power you need to keep that tent in place. So again, just recognize that there is a difference here between how a product is designed, how those design features, how those design attributes impact features, and ultimately how those features benefit you. And I really would like you to focus on the benefits of a product, and especially its unique benefits, because that will help you become a better decision maker, not only in the store when you're shopping for products and choosing them and buying them, but also when you're selecting products from multiple similar ones for a particular use case or trip. Okay, so we have 3 shelters here. We have a Slingfin NFT tarp on the left, a Z-Pax Hexamid pocket tarp in the middle, the Durston X-Mid Pro on the right. So all 3 are what have been called, ultralight shelters, so to speak, but very different sets of design elements or attributes. So each of these offers very different, unique benefits. If we look at the design of a tarp, its unique design attribute is that it has an open perimeter and no floor. If we move over to a full perimeter pyramid like the Hexamid, then we're looking at a full perimeter but still no floor. And then graduating to the Durston X-Mid Pro, we have a fully enclosed shelter with a screened interior. So you can see that these design attributes are very objective. We're just describing the product, but notice how they then translate into features and benefits. So if we look strictly at condensation resistance, for example, we may assume that a flat tarp, because it is not a full perimeter shelter, has lots of airflow. We can assume that the Hexamid, which does have a full perimeter shelter design, but is pitched a little bit higher so that those walls don't really come down to the ground functionally, then you have a moderate amount of airflow. And then with the Durston X-Mid, where you have a low to the ground pitch, full perimeter, fully enclosed shelter, you have minimal airflow, at least relative to the other 2 shelters. It doesn't mean it's minimal in the context of the broader market, of course. Now think of these design attributes and the features they create, and then how those features translate to either benefits or disadvantages to you as a user. So for me, the tarp provides me with cooler temperatures, so I don't get so stuffy in there if I'm having to camp on warm nights. In addition, because of the airflow, it gives me a drier experience with less condensation. And then the unique thing about the tarp that I really like is the versatility of the pitch. I can pitch it in an A-frame. I can pitch it in a lean-to. I can create a storm pitch like what is shown in the photo there. If we move over to the Hexamid, then the unique benefit to this particular tent is that it's really dang light. So compared to the other 2 shelters, it's quite a bit lighter. It's also less fabric. It's quite a bit more compact. And because you have lots of airflow around the bottom perimeter of the tent underneath the fly, you have a drier experience than you would, for example, in the tent to the right. So the tent to the right, the Durston X-Mid, is going to be a warmer tent because you can button it up, you can pitch it a little bit lower, and you can retain more of the heat inside. So while the tarp represents a cooler experience on a warm night, you might look at the flip side of that and say the X-Mid provides me with a warmer experience on a cool night. Likewise, you've got a floor, fully screened interior, and the benefit to the X-Mid is that it is a bug-free experience, or at least it minimizes bug entry. So when I'm thinking about shelters, and I'm spending a lot of time on shelters because they're one of the more complicated gear categories, and they represent probably the single most confounding category purchase for most backpackers. So the 6 core benefits, there's actually 7. I'll list the 7th, but I didn't have room to put it on the slide. But the 6 core benefits that I look for in a shelter are: number 1 on the upper left, do I enjoy spending time inside the tent? That's a livability issue. And so again, we're looking at the design attributes of headroom, floor space, wall steepness, vestibule area. The second one in the upper center is, am I going to stay warm, dry, and secure, physically and psychologically secure during storms? And so now I'm looking at the design attributes and features of wind stability, perimeter protection, and a bathtub floor. The third attribute is, am I going to get harassed by mosquitoes? And so a fully screened, enclosed interior is going to be your design attribute that gives you that benefit. The fourth one on the lower left is, does this tent make hiking fun? Now, this is a soft side benefit, but it is one that resonates with me because I want my hiking experience, that is the hours in the day where I'm carrying the backpack and the tent is in my backpack, is more fun when my backpack is lighter and thus when my tent is lighter. So the weight of the tent goes into this particular benefit. And is packing easy? So is the tent compact enough where I can stow it just about anywhere? Does it have long pole sets that can't be placed inside the main backpack and maybe have to be stored outside? Or are they really thin, fragile carbon fiber poles that I got to take care of? These are all questions that I ask when it comes to packing a tent. The fifth benefit on the lower middle is, can I stay hidden? Is it stealthy? This is a narrow use case for me, but one that I do appreciate a couple of times a year. So I'm looking for shelters that have a muted colorway and a low profile. And then the sixth and final attribute in this table is, am I going to stay dry? The sixth and final benefit, not attribute. Am I going to stay dry in cold temperatures? And then the design attributes are things like the tent has a double wall and or a solid inner tent. The tent fabrics might be breathable in the case of single wall tents versus non-breathable. Or is there options to have an open perimeter so I can get airflow in the tent even during an overhead rain? Now, the seventh benefit that I've did not put on this slide is, does the tent provide blizzard protection? And I'll talk a little bit about that later. That's primarily a winter use case. So I have these two trips in August. My first one was the Sierra High Route trip, and my second one is a Never Summer wilderness trip that I'm leaving on Monday. So the Sierra High Route trip is with kids. We're fishing. We're not doing high miles. We're doing hard terrain, but nothing too crazy. And so I can afford to take a little bit of extra pack weight. So weight and packability are not going to be the core benefits I'm looking for in a shelter on this trip. The things I did know is that we were going to face a lot of rain, and I was going to spend a fair bit of time in my tent, probably cooking, reading, writing, relaxing, napping, whatever. So I wanted a tent that was supremely livable. I knew we were going to get a lot of overhead rain. There was not a lot of prevailing wind. This is before the hurricane front came through the Sierras. And so I knew I needed storm security. So I needed a dry tent with a bathtub floor. The Sierras were very wet up in the tundra. And so campsites were limited, and we had to spend a number of nights on sites that were either wet and flooded or became wet and flooded with the next storm cycle. So bathtub floor, good vestibule protection and overhead protection from rain, not hugely concerned with wind. Mosquitoes were horrendous at lower elevations, so I needed a tent that gave me protection from bugs. I didn't care about stealth, didn't care about weight or packability too much. I mean, I always care about weight and packability. And I didn't care about condensation because I knew that these storms were going to be intermittent and I wasn't going to be buttoned up in this, non-breathable fabric cocoon the whole time. So condensation really wasn't an issue. That led me to choose the tent in my quiver that dialed in livability, storm security, and mosquitoes better than any other tent in my quiver. And that happened to be the Tarp Tent Dipole 1 Lithium. So now let's switch over to the Never Summers, which is a very different track. I am attempting a traverse. It's a circumnavigation of the Never Summers with my son. It's a wilderness in Colorado to the west of the Continental Divide, west of us here in Estes Park. And we're going light and fast, and we're doing some very hard traverses. And so weight and packability are going to be my number one concern here. My number two concern is condensation. We are expecting the two things, the remnants of the hurricane storm systems to hit the Never Summers in the early part of our trek, and then colder temperatures. So we're starting to approach late August now, and the temperatures are really starting to drop. Those cold temperatures impact condensation significantly. I'm still taking a down bag, but I also want a tent that I can pitch a little bit higher where I can get some airflow through it so condensation is not too extreme. So those are my two primary drivers for choosing a tent. I need some kind of storm security because we are expecting heavy rains early in our trek. I don't know about mosquitoes, but I'm going to roll the dice and say mosquitoes are not going to be an issue here. So I'm going to prioritize weight over mosquito protection in this case. And I'll throw in a 0.6 of an ounce head net and some mosquito repellent if it really gets that bad. Okay, so that leads me to choose the 6.5 ounce shelter, the Z-Packs Hexamid Pocket Tarp with doors versus the Tarp Tent Dipole Lithium, which is about 1.5 pounds. So significant amount of weight savings, but obviously I'm giving up livability, wind and storm protection, and mosquito protection in exchange for that. But I'm still getting an overhead shelter that protects me from rain. So to kind of summarize this discussion, I want to emphasize that a product's most unique benefit may be the driver that helps you make decisions on what gear to take on a particular trek. So I've got these 6 shelters in my quiver right now, and embarrassingly, I have more than that, but I didn't want to show them to you. I'm hoping to sell them, but these are the ones that I'm kind of hanging on to right now. So the Tarp Tent Dipole 1 lithium on the upper left is the one I've been using far and away the most over the last 2 years, mainly because it does something no other shelter does as well at this weight range, and that is provide palatial livability and really solid wind resistance because it uses both 2 trekking poles for setup and has 2 carbon fiber end struts. And those 4 structural components really make it a solid shelter in the wind. In the center top, I have the Slingfin NFT tarp, which you've heard about before on office hours and in the newsletter. And again, this is my tarp of choice. And I choose this when condensation and pitch flexibility are the 2 things I want the most. Now, if I don't have extreme weather or bugs or huge storms to deal with, I'm going to grab the tarp almost every time because I like tarp camping. It's my favorite shelter to use. But this year I've tarp camped less than any other summer, mainly because the mosquitoes have been so bad. And we've had rain almost every day here in Colorado all summer long. And so lots of wet tundra, lots of wet campsites. The tent on the right is the 10 ounce Locust Gear Kufu. And this is my shelter of choice in the fringe seasons when I'm looking to go as light as possible, but I want some serious storm resistance. So my ultralight shelters here are the Kufu and the tent on the lower left, which is the Z-Packs Hexamid Pocket Tarp. Both of these, the Kufu is a little bit heavier, but provides a massive more amount of storm resistance than the Pocket Tarp. So that brings us to the main benefit of the Pocket Tarp on the lower left, and that is extremely lightweight. So this is my fast packing shelter, and packability. So lightweight, and when I need my kit to have a very small volume, I'm going for the Hexamid. The Durston X-Mid is in the lower center of this photo. There's a lot of crossover between this shelter and the Tarp Tent Dipole 1. Both tents are 2 trekking pole, 2 vestibule, 2 side entry solo shelters. The X-Mid has the advantage in that it's very easy to set up. I am spending a lot of time with the X-Mid because I want to make sure I have the experience to be able to compare it fairly to the other DCF solo two trekking pole shelters on the market, which is a probably one of the most popular categories within our community. And I want to be able to really understand this category. So I'm keeping it in my quiver because I want the experience with it. And then the lower right is the Hilleberg Solo. This is a geodesic dome tent that has the advantage in the winter of blizzard comfort and snow loading stability with heavy snow loads on it. So you have, when I say blizzard comfort, I mean, can the tent withstand snow loading? Can it keep blowing spindrift out, which requires either a single wall sealable shelter with no vents or a double wall shelter like this with a fully solid fabric inner tent? And can it block the wind? And again, this is a single wall, fully enclosed shelter or a double wall tent with a solid fabric interior, being able to keep drafts out and keep you warm inside your tent. So again, in this slide, I want to summarize. Ask yourself a question: what is the product's most unique benefit, and how am I going to choose that product on a particular trip? And this will help you if you lay out all of your backpacking stoves, assuming you're not a stove collector and you have 10 stoves and they're all upright canister stoves. I guarantee you that you will be, once you start asking the question, what's the unique benefit of each of these stoves? You'll be able to get rid of at least 7, maybe 8 of those stoves. So I've been able to do this. I'm down to 2 stoves, 2 upright canister stoves. I have one that's ultralight and small and one that works really well in the wind. So that's my 2 use cases. And those are the unique benefits it provides. Okay, all this discussion goes into the update of the publisher's gear guide. There's a QR code, which you can scan on the screen. It's also linked to from the article feed that exists in various locations on the site, on Backpacking Light site. So it's been a couple years since I updated this. I completely changed my rationale for putting gear into this gear guide. I'm only putting gear in that I've used in the last year. So if I haven't used it, it goes, and it usually goes away permanently from my gear closet. Second thing is, it's gear that is often has been in my kit for several years. There are some new additions every year, and some gear gets kicked out. But for the most part, this is gear that I own. In most cases, I purchased with my own money, and gear that represents the stuff I get to choose on personal trips when I have no other agendas, when I don't have to review gear for a manufacturer and I don't have to do testing for an article or anything like that. So this is the gear that I would shop for, buy, and choose myself for these particular use cases. The gear guide is structured in a database table, and on the right-hand side of the table, I give a snippet, my comment that I use to really try to dial in the unique benefit of that piece of gear and or the use case in which I choose that gear over another piece of gear in that same category. Lots of different categories. It's not comprehensive. I'm going to keep adding to the gear guide throughout the course of the rest of this year, and then maintain this page appropriately as gear leaves or comes into my regular gear kit.